When you're modeling, there are times when you'll want to combine multiple objects into one or separate objects apart. And for those, we can use combine and separate. Now let's take a look at a simple object here. Actually, this is three objects. Now usually we'll stick parts together using the outliner, but this is for parts that move in relation to each other. So for example, if I take a look at this robot arm here, you'll see that I've got a right shoulder that's connected to the right arm, that's connected to the hand. But each of these will probably be moving in relation to the other when we actually get to the scene. But we have this hand here, and you'll see that we've got parts of the hand that really don't move relative to the hand, and those are these rings that are on either side of this. So if I take a look at this in wireframe, you'll see that the hand is actually composed of these rings, and these rings are actually full pieces of geometry. But because they're not moving relative to the hand, I've combined them all into one piece of geometry. And this actually reduces my overhead. I don't have as many parts in my scene to manage, and it makes it much more efficient to work. So let's take a look at how to combine and separate objects so we can create something like this. Now in this scene, I actually have a couple of layers set up, so I want to make sure I'm in my channel box here and go down to layers, and let's go ahead and switch off the arm layer. And that gives us pretty much a clean slate from which to work. So let's go ahead and make a simple object using combine. I'm going to start off with a simple polygon cylinder here. And I'm going to make this into kind of like a handle. So I'm going to go ahead and make it fairly thin, a little bit longer, something about like that. And then I'm going to select a polygon cube and create that. And I'm going to make it something like this shape, a little bit longer than it is wide. And then let's go ahead and just drag up some height to that. And I'm going to turn on shading here. And let's go ahead and position this. And as you can see, we've got a very crude hammer. Now, if I look at this in the outliner, you'll see we have basically two objects here. We have a cylinder and a cube. So the cylinder is basically the handle, and I can certainly name it handle. And the cube is basically the hammer, right? So it's the head of the hammer. So if I wanted to, I could create a hierarchy where the hammer head is the child of the handle and so on and so forth. But typically with a hammer, the head doesn't really come flying off. It's basically one unit. So let's go ahead and make it one unit using combine. So I'm going to go ahead and select the hammerhead first, and then shift select the handle of the object. And then we're going to go into our polygon menu set and make sure we have mesh combine. And when I do that, watch what happens to the outliner. These switch over to kind of reference groups, and then we get one object here called hammer. And I select that, and now I've got one object. Now the thing about Maya is that it actually keeps track of history. By default, it basically keeps track of everything you do, so you can undo it, or you can go back and change parameters. And this is a good example of this. If I want, I can go back to, say, my hammerhead and move that, okay? And this is actually just a link to the original. Or I can go to the actual geometry that I created called Hammer 1. And if we scroll down in the channel box here, you'll see that I've got a bunch more inputs. I have cylinder, cube, and one called unite, which is actually my combine function. And we can probably see this a little more accurately in the attribute editor. Notice how we have a lot of tabs here along the top. We have our main node, which determines where the object is. We have the shape of the object, but then we have a number of other ones that affect the shape. So we have this unite command, which is basically, again, combining the objects, but we're combining a cube and a cylinder. So I actually have the original creation parameters for my cube and my cylinder right here. So I can give my cube more subdivisions if I want. I can give my cylinder more subdivisions. I can really change them however I want. And that's because I have history turned on. Now, this is all great and dandy, but as you start working with stuff, you'll start to build up a lot of history to your objects. And so you may want to simplify, and we can do that just by deleting history. So I select my object and go Edit, delete by type. Now there's two of these. There's delete all by type and delete by type. You want to make sure you get the first one here because that's on an object by object basis rather than for the whole scene. So I go delete by type, history, and watch what happens in the outliner. Those two reference objects go away. All I have left is my hammer geometry, and then my hammer geometry basically simplifies down. So all of that back history goes away, and then now it's just one simple object. And this makes it a lot more efficient within Maya. Now, in addition to this, we can start to separate objects. So let's say I have an object that's combined, or I have some geometry that I want to break off from other geometry. I can use the separate command to do that. So if I select my object here, I can just do mesh separate. Now what separate does is it basically looks for stuff that's been combined, so stuff that's not actually connected together, and it separates it. So once I do select my object, I do mesh separate. Notice how this changes. Now I have basically two objects. I have this object and this object, and now they're separated. Now they've lost their original names, but you can see they're still separate objects. Now, in addition to this, if you want to break off part of an object, you can also do what's called extract. So if I right-click over this, select the face, I can do mesh extract, and what that does is it breaks the object in two. So now I've created two objects here, one which is the lower part of the hammer, and one is the top. Now, this is a little bit different than separate in that it disconnects existing geometry that's connected together. So, combine sticks things together. Separate separates things that are already not connected. And then extract breaks apart things that are connected. So let's go ahead and do something that's a little bit more practical here. I'm going to go into my channel box and turn on the layer called Parts. Now what I want to do is I want to create the base part of this character's hand. So I've got three parts here. I'm going to select the Parts layer, make sure that's visible, and you see I've got this basic object here, which is just a sphere where I flattened out the top, and then I've got these two pipes here which represent those rings on the character's arms. So all I want to do is go ahead and move those rings into place and position them. I'm going to go into my front viewport here and position this one and make sure that they're both positioned properly. And once we do, let's go ahead and select our hand base first, shift select our two rings, and again, we're just going to combine these. So I'm going to go mesh, combine, and so now I have one object. Now, as before, it's kept track of the history. So I've got my ring and each one of these. So I've got all of these objects left over. So I'm going to go ahead and select that hand base and go Edit, Delete by Type, History, and now I have my one object. So those are some of the basics of how to combine, separate, and extract objects from Maya.